Hello, everybody. Welcome to MHTV. We're really pleased to be talking to the fantastic Mike and Grant tonight. And what we're going to be looking at is empathy as an intervention. So before we get started, I'll hand you to Vanessa, and she can tell you how you can join in on social media.
Thank you, Nicky. Hello, everyone. If you want to join us on Facebook tonight, then that would be great. If you head over to Facebook Live, Unite MHNA Facebook page, like the page if you haven't already, and you should see the live feed there. We'd love you to ask any questions, comments. I'll be looking at those as we go through the episode and adding them into the discussion. If you prefer Twitter, just follow MHTV hashtag and the conversation will be on there. And again, you can ask any questions and we'll bring them into the episode. I'll hand you back to Nicky.
Fantastic. All right, so let's come to our guests to introduce themselves. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Mike Ramsay. I've been a nurse for 37 years as of last Saturday. And a mental health nurse for the greater bulk of those. I did do my general nurse training first. I've been an academic for 17 years. I trained in the much more traditional way in the old modular training, and I come at empathy as something that I was inspired by one particular lecturer back in those days, my doctoral thesis was around compassion in nursing and social work, which obviously touched on empathy on the way through. So that's where I come at this topic from.
Fantastic. And Grant, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Nicky. My name is Grant King. I'm a lecturer in mental health nursing and I'm the academic lead for learning and disability. And I've had the pleasure of working with Mike for the last 8 years at the University of Dundee. Prior to that, I had in some ways a rather unusual career. I was a mental health nurse. My specialty is CAMS, so children, and particularly children with developmental disorders and comorbid mental health issues is my clinical specialty. But I also took some time in my career to focus on spiritual care. And worked as a spiritual care advisor for mental health services up in the NHS Tayside. And that's one of the reasons, like Mike, I've come to be really focused on sort of values and particularly empathy, because lots of my work was rooted very much in sort of relational intervention. I'll come back in a wee bit more detail about that, but really lots of my work has been focused on who we are and how we are with people and how it affects them. And Mike and I, for many years, have enjoyed in our offices when in real life we could actually see each other and speak to each other, spent many a time kind of thinking fairly deeply about compassion and empathy and the role it's played in our lives personally, clinically and academically.
Maybe a good place to start then would be to sort of nail down what we mean by empathy. If you want to come back to me on that.
Yeah, well, so one of the things that, when we look at empathy, and we hear lots of kind of rhetoric around the idea of, seeing through another's eyes, which was the name of a project I'll talk about later that was involved in, or understanding someone's feelings or knowing how someone feels. But the reality, that's just a conceptual definition from an application, from a clinical point of view. We're never going to really understand how anyone feels. In fact, I've often said to my students, if in practice in your career you ever say to someone, I really understand how you feel, I'm going to magically appear and kick you. Because we'll just never really, we don't teach telepathy, we'll never really know how someone feels, because it's always about sort of subjective interpretation in the interaction. So what we wanted to do was look at it from a much more kind of applied perspective. What does it really mean? And where we're kind of circling just now is around, it's about that sincere desire to understand. That's really where it's happening, what you bring to someone. And I'll reference a lot of Carol Rogers' work, I guess, is about what you bring, and that it's that sincerity and that real desire to understand that for us is the sort of clinical application of empathy.
Did you want to add to that, Mike? So what is empathy? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, in terms of empathy, I see it as being an activity or a way of being with someone that involves a lot of emotional labour. I think you have to work hard to be empathic with another person, and that emotional labour takes practice. So I think it's a skill set and a value set that you need to work at to become proficient at. And in terms of its linkage with compassion, I see them as very, very separate. Just yesterday in class, a very good question about Are they not one and the same in some kind of way? And so we teased that out in the class. The class wasn't particularly about that. It was about values generally, but we teased that out in the class. And I see them as being overlapping, as linked. Of course, I think the biggest difference between empathy and compassion for me is that empathy is not solely concerned with distress. You can sense someone else's joy or their passion for something like their faith or for their political belief, for example. So whereas compassion, I think, is always concerned with alleviating distress in the other. But as mental health nurses, obviously we come at empathy usually at a point of trying to be with someone who is in emotional distress. And so, but I think there is the very marked difference between empathy and compassion. That compassion is always really about distress, about alleviating distress.
And suppose you do, like, you feel for someone, you feel with somebody. How do you turn that sort of emotional connection, that link, into practical help for somebody? How would you see that going?
I think sometimes conveying empathic understanding with another person is itself therapeutic. I think the fact that someone can be heard and often for the first time can probably hear their own experience reflected back to them is of itself therapeutic for people. I did read a paper last week, a medical paper actually, about empathy, and saying that leaving a situation as empathic understanding may be an arena for distress for the individual, and that the doctor in this case has to go on and do something else. That's a point of contention, arguably, but it's also maybe a point of accuracy. But often people who are in psychological distress, they've not been able to unravel or unpack their thinking in this way, and to have someone else be with them and convey something back that is really meaningful and accurate, maybe itself a therapeutic intervention.
So there's a phrase, Mike and I, Nicky, have taught counselling skills together for a number of years, and lots of our discussion has been based on that sort of organic experience in the classroom. And us learning as we teach, which I think is a really powerful model. And there's a phrase, one of the kind of terms that we talk about is to pay attention. And to pay attention sounds like, well, it's common sense, And one of the things we kind of sort of invite students to think about in class is what both of those words mean, because too often the word attention gets too much attention, but the word pay is really interesting as you start to deconstruct it, because pay is about cost, sacrifice, is about reciprocity, to give, to take. And so we start to ask students, what is the payment when you're paying attention? And it is about that presence. It's about the journey of, and one of the other kind of sort of values that I like to tease out a lot is about the idea of non-judgmentalism. I'm not a big fan of that phrase. Again, like empathy, I see the concept and its value, but I don't believe as human beings it's actually an accessible plateau to exist upon. We make judgments. We're built to make judgments. So something about the idea of acceptance rather than non-judgmentalism is a good value for us. So the payment is about self-awareness, where you recognise how you see people, how you might judge them, and then how you accept them. So as Mike said, this is very much about the emotional labour, and it's a high-level cognitive activity to be with someone, to want to be there, to want to understand their world from a place of compassion. So practically, the whole idea of the investment of emotional labour requires a lot of supportive mechanisms around practice. It requires time, it requires space, it requires people valuing it. We all know as mental health nurses this great stereotype about other fields perhaps looking at us and thinking, that whole, all you do is sit around, drink coffee and talk to people. I'm at a point now where I say you're absolutely right, because that's a profound, powerful existential experience, to be with someone and to help them feel heard, perhaps possibly for the first time in their life.
Definitely, yeah. So you talked a little bit about the kind of emotional labour. Do you think that we're set up to support people to do that? Because when I think about services, particularly kind of inpatient services, the kind of task orientation, the busyness, I wonder if maybe empathy is something that's a little bit under threat sometimes.
I would agree with that. So for a number of years, I taught a CPD course on being a reflective practitioner. And one of the things I did was I shared the decades-old evidence that we have where having a regular, structured opportunity to reflect on practice is incredibly profound and powerful across a whole range of kind of metrics, whether it's morale, absence. But for us, it's actually about engagement and attendance. So, if I were, the minister for, responsible for healthcare, whether in the UK or in Scotland, indeed, one of the first things I would do is make supervision a mandatory part of clinical practice, that you would not be allowed to practice unless you had recorded regular appropriate supervision, because that's, for me, is the space where we find the energy and the opportunity to empower ourselves when we're back in practice. If you know that space is coming, I think, regularly, that will very much help us. So from a practical standpoint, if we can give people that space, and Scotland values based reflective practice is very popular through the departments of spiritual care, both group and individual, and I think that would be a real change agent if we could invest in that and recognise that's a place where the empathic endeavours could be reinforced and recharged.
Did you want to come in at all, Mike?
Yeah. In the literature review that I undertook, Doyle and others, 2014, to get academic on ourselves, they talked about restating or re-emphasising the place, or reinstilling or reinstalling empathy into undergraduate nursing curricula, not just mental health nursing curricula, across nursing curricula. And I remember when I read that I thought that was a bit strange in some respects. I never thought it had gone, but then I'm involved in the delivery of it, and I'm involved in the delivery of it to mental health nurses primarily, not exclusively, primarily, and so obviously their studies taken a wider sweep at the issue, and it was a post-Francis inquiry sweep at the concept of empathy in undergraduate curricula. So that would suggest that certainly commentators were worried or had uncovered perhaps a trend that empathy was under threat. Also in my study, because I looked at social workers, the social work literature is full of issues around empathy, and particularly, I thought, interestingly, from a semantic point of view, empathy as a cause of compassion fatigue, which is a bit of a conceptual mismatch, it would seem, certainly at least on a semantic, if not on a conceptual level. But the other thing is that was very prominent in the social work literature around empathy and compassion was a context of a railing against neoliberal managerialism within the profession, that they felt thwarted the enablement with clients, the ability to be with another in their distress or in their problems, and to help on that context. And it was about caseload management, and it was about allocation of time and getting the job done and being risk aware, and not actually doing what they felt they were educated to do, which was to be there and to enable and to help on a very human level.
So do you notice much difference then between the way social workers and mental health nurses see compassion and empathy? Was there any significant differences?
There's quite significant differences in the realms of compassion, because although it appears in the social work code of ethics, it doesn't necessarily appear, for example, in BASWA's code of practice. And empathy is a much stronger disposition or value for social work to embrace, certainly in the UK. But social workers themselves, when I spoke to them in my focus groups, they very much said that they were compassionate individuals. They were drawn to their field of practice by a sense of wanting to help, and to people who were struggling to help themselves. And so it's very much a compassionate place to come from, but very much encouraged to be empathic in their cultural socialisation as trainee social workers and as students. So empathy, a much stronger flavour in social work compared to nursing as a whole, where compassion, societally, sociopolitically, is an imposition on nursing in some respects. Most people come to nursing because they want to be compassionate towards other people who are unwell, but there is that whole thing around the society doesn't judge nursing care to be excellent unless it is technically good and compassionate. A sort of socio-political imperative for nursing to be compassionate. I make a claim, and it is a claim rather than anything based on hard evidence, that I still think that empathy is a very useful end game as a primary pro-social way of relating in mental health nursing, however.
I can see that Vanessa's going to come in as well now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things for me, everything you've said tonight resonates, and it's subjects that I'm really interested in as well. But one of the things for me, what strikes me when you were talking about social workers, is thinking about something that I always think around, and that's about what inhibits empathy in terms of repeated exposure to high stress situations. And one of the things I think that where nurses differ from social workers and other professionals in terms of working on wards, for example, or working in a prison area, is that they're often there for 7.5 hours a day, continuously responding to incidents, whereas working in the community or maybe as a social worker and just seeing somebody for sessions, it's not the same, like prolonged exposure to stress. And I know when I worked in the prisons, I saw newly qualified nurses coming in, very empathic and compassionate, and within 6 months seeing huge symptoms of burnout, disassociation, lack of interest. And I do think that we need to think more about trauma and how we respond to that. And I think it links to what Grant was saying about supervision, but it's also more than that. I used to be involved in debriefing people following suicides and stress, really traumatic incidents. And I'll always remember, a few things nurses said to me about how they couldn't allow themselves to get emotionally involved when they were exposed to trauma following having seen suicides and other traumatic incidents, because they felt that so vulnerable and exposed and fragile. But they also felt that they had to self-protect as well. And so I do think this is something we don't talk about very much in nursing, but I do think it's a real issue, and it should be part of the empathy and compassion discussion.
So think about how many times we see senior nurses saying to new starters, don't get too involved.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you can actually be punished for being empathetic with people. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have boundaries, of course you should. But I think sometimes when people have had that hurt themselves, they try maybe to overreach when they're trying to protect younger staff and students. What do you think, Grant? Are you thinking about that?
Yeah, no, I think a lot about that. I mean, this is there's lots of thoughts. There's the tension around vocation versus profession, which has existed for us in nursing. The idea of skillful self-giving, that phrase, but actually, where's the boundary of self in that phrase? There's the tension for me, and people that follow me on Twitter will know I've got some fairly strong views on resilience in terms of a concept that moves the stress to the individual rather than making organisational systems bear the stress and burden. And so I think Vanessa's absolutely right. So supervision is part of it. I think a wider sort of organisational recognition that and I'm tempted by the word sort of sensitivity rather than fragility of individuals is actually something that we should applaud, support, and absolutely invest in. And the recognition that it is a very natural defence mechanism when one has been hurt, to not be hurt further. That in and of itself. Oh, okay. I'm getting the. You're about to be signed out your computer. Snooze.
Stay with us, Grant.
I think in 14 minutes it's going to do what it likes, whether I like it or not.
It's the way with computers.
Such as the technical world. So what one of the things in terms of, before I get cut off, that I definitely want to make sure that we talk about is some of where art and humanities plays a role in nurse education with respect to learning about empathy and understanding empathy. So in the team, we've had over the last few years a couple of particularly good projects that looked at that. So in 2016, we had a project called Seeing Through Another's Eyes, which very much sounds like empathy, doesn't it? And we worked together with a service user who's an artist. And she created pieces of work in relation to sort of mental health themes each week through a module. And what we did was we presented the nursing students with those pieces of art and just sat with them and said, please spend some time looking at this art and wondering what were the thoughts and feelings of the person as they created it. And that idea of just that 2-word sort of phrase, I wonder, is really what empathy is about. I sincerely wonder what your world is about. So they would look at the art, they would have some personal reflection, they'd discuss it in a group, and then we'd have... So we wanted to open up this kind of sort of normalising of just wondering about people's lives. So that was one kind of piece of work we did. And the other is that I'm a big fan of the sort of use of comics. And we've released a number of comics around suicide, around nursing and COVID. We're very lucky at University of Dundee because we've got the only professor of comics as far as we're aware in the whole world. So we've done a lot of work with them. And the thing about comic or sequential art is that it gives you the external and the internal narrative at the same time. So, you have the speech bubble where you've got someone talking, but then you have the thought bubble where you get another perspective. And that, again, was visually was a really good way of helping people understand how to think about what's internal and what's external, and to use those as a medium of really just trying to kind of almost sort of train in this thought of, I wonder what's going on in this person's life. I wonder how it affects them. I wonder how, if it was me, how it would change me.
You're sort of talking about kindliness and curiosity at the same time. I was also wondering, for those people who constantly talk about nurse education as being like, nurses they just need to be kind. They just need to be kind. So how does empathy play into that? Because obviously you're saying empathy is a hugely important skill. So how is it a graduate skill, would you say?
That sounds like Mike's thesis right there.
Yeah. I think there's two ways of addressing that particular question. One is that I rail against the concept of pro-social relating to other human beings as being a soft skill. I rail against the concept of care as being low-tech. I think both are extremely... both ways of looking at that are extremely, I think, complex and nuanced. And I think you need a level of intellectual skill, but of course, intellectual intelligence. But I think you also need a highly attuned sense of emotional intelligence. Now, you can be emotionally intelligent without studying a degree, but I think you've got a much better chance of achieving both intellectual capacity at that level and emotional capacity at that level if you pursue a graduate preparation. I also rail against the term training. I hate the term nurse training because it suggests a very task-oriented way of educating somebody, and I think the complexity involved in becoming empathically and compassionately able are graduate level skills. The other rather more linear way of thinking about that is the minute that you say that nurses must be graduates to register in the profession, all new graduates must be all new registrants must be graduates, you immediately confer it to being a graduate level skill just in a very linear societal way. You're saying in order to be a nurse, you have to be a graduate, and if compassion and empathy are part of that skill set, they become graduate attributes by dint of that. The other side of that discussion as well is that around being a graduate, and these skills do exist out with graduate existence, is that they're part of a marbled or a mosaic pattern of skills, values, and knowledge that nurses require. And I think I'm currently writing something about the hero narrative that's become much more endemic since the pandemic has occurred, and the angel narrative has reared its head again as well. And one of the things is that I think they simplify and actually denigrate nursing's complexity. Definitely. And so empathy and compassion, along with other graduate skills, are part of that mosaic of complex care, skill and human relating that is absolutely essential in the modern world of nursing for me.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
And I guess I see the other element as a graduate attribute around, it isn't just about having a sincere desire to be empathic and understand. It's knowing what to do when you get there. That's something. So how to handle that position, how to deal with vicarious trauma that Vanessa's talked about. Those experiences when I was a CAMS nurse, when I'm sitting with a wee sort of an 8-year-old boy, seeing myself in some of the things he's having those in the moment kind of experiences, kind of epiphanies, and knowing how to deal with that safely. So empathy is both not a graduate attribute because everyone can do it, but it's actually when to do it, how to recover from it, and where to take it, I guess, is where it becomes more of a graduate skill.
And I think there's something almost around the judicious use of empathy, as Grant's suggesting there, is very much knowing what to reach into your nursing toolkit to select. It's definitely a highly tuned skill, and I love the teaching of this, because in a class, not only do I still learn every time I teach this with Grant, it's great to see that some people have a keener sense of how to do this, almost an innate sense, or they've got life experience or life skills that allow them to be able to access this kind of skill acquisition more readily. But it's also great to see the people for whom this is a real challenge. It's the first time they've really thought about it. They've had to deconstruct the way they listen or engage, or they've had to consider themselves and their self-awareness for the first time. And you can see the growth over the not even over a day in class, but certainly over the life of their time with us, how they develop in that respect. And that's really rewarding in itself, just in the way that empathy can be really rewarding for the practitioner.
Absolutely.
Which is a wee bit about why Mike and I both share some strong views about sort of the concept of nurse training, even the term student nurse, to be honest. But it's actually about our programme isn't about only becoming a registered nurse. I mean, there's so much human growth available, in a broader sense, that I think, people will say, I feel like I'm a better person, not just that I'm now a registered nurse with knowledge, but I actually feel like a better person, a sort of broader kind of human than, so in terms of, it's not just about training, it is about actually having nurses do that. I mean, one of the reasons I came to this, Nicky, is because I like to roll this really controversial line out, particularly with colleagues from other,
everyone.
other fields. So I went from being a band 5 staff nurse to being a band 7 senior charge nurse. My nursing career, I've never once, as a registered nurse, ever administered any medication. I have never taken any vital signs. From being a band 5 to band 7, I've never done any of that. My entire profession was about relational intervention. It was all about the therapeutic use of self. I haven't really practiced particularly in any other way. And so for some people that seems like, are you even a nurse? Because you've not done those things, and that's where I've been, on my journey, is around what does it mean to be a nurse, actually.
We'll see if anyone who's watching has anything to say about that, but I can see we've got some questions building up, so I'll just come to Vanessa and see what Vanessa has for us.
Yeah, we've got a few questions. I like this one from Alfonso, which is when we talk about Alfonso's a regular with the questions, but I think this is really quite interesting about cultural competence. So he says, when we talk about empathy and compassion, we need to look from a cultural competence perspective, as these two words mean different things to different people. And when we believe we are being empathic, this might not necessarily be perceived as such by service users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point.
So my time in spiritual care probably connects this quite well, because oftentimes I wouldn't even use the word spirituality, chaplaincy, because of those being very loaded terms, and it was very much about what's important to you, what brings meaning, purpose and value. And so I absolutely agree with Alfonso about the cultural competence. I guess fundamentally we could have this whole discussion without you ever using the word empathy, and simply, it's a sincere desire to understand what's going on for you. And I'm one for trying to simplify things. So I think, we can talk about compassion and empathy, but if we just kind of say, I've got a real strong sense that I want to try and alleviate your distress, and the best way to do that is to really try and listen to your story, see the picture that you're painting of your life experience to this point. Hopefully that would be helpful, whatever cultural backgrounds, whatever cultural context we're working within.
Yeah, I think it can be the same as well in terms of when somebody is really unwell, or somebody, you work supporting who's got dementia. I know I had like a really profound experience years ago where I got approached by somebody supporting an acute ward, probably 15 years before. And she came up to me in the street and recognised me and said, I remember you, because even though you had to stop me from leaving, you were always kind to me, and you always talked to me, because we were similar age. So she said, you always talked to me about things like, fashion and, books and things that were really human. And she remembered that. And I remember that she was very, very unwell at the time. And it's interesting that what she remembered from that encounter was about empathy, I think. And I think it's quite similar, isn't it, with working with someone with dementia. They might not remember between interactions, but often they remember how you've made somebody feel, and you're able to leave that with a place of empathy as well, and compassion.
Definitely. Got a few more questions left to go, haven't we?
And so we've got another one from Alfonso. Let me just read it. We almost believe that empathy is embedded in our profession, and our teaching reflects this. But really, are we teaching our future nurses and social workers to nurture their empathy and compassionate skills? And his question is, what tips and advice would you give to nurse educators to make sure that empathy and compassion are threaded through the curriculum? So there you go.
I'll take that, and I think he begins to answer his question immediately by saying threaded through the curriculum. The concept of teaching empathy in an afternoon or compassion in a lecture, it's really the focus of my own work, was that to show that probably doesn't work, and that people don't believe that works. There is good evidence that a coalition of approaches, and done over time, and not only about focusing on the individual practitioner or student, but focusing on the teams in which they function, the culture in which that team operates, and indeed the organisational support and celebration and the courage to embrace empathy and compassion all have to be in place in order for compassion and empathy to be nurtured over time. Some good evidence in the social work literature around that a self-compassionate social worker is more likely to be able to express fellow feeling for clients, because they're in a better place, because they have good healthy self-regard for themselves. It's not selfish, it's selfish in the right way. It's about selfish in order to function at the best. But that's not enough if the team doesn't celebrate the ability to relate to people and to care for people. And that's the same for our students. So in that respect, that threading through a curriculum is really important, but it also needs to be threaded through placement, which is very important. It's 50% of the curriculum. Learning doesn't end and it's just work. And it's one of the things I don't like. I'm going to work. No, you're going to learn. You're going to placement to learn. You do undertake tasks and you do work when you're there, but you learn when you're there, or you ought to learn when you're there. And that's part of that marbling through. And I think the big thing that we do miss in a very busy and highly pressured world, NHS could take a dunt for this, but it's not just the NHS, it's wherever arenas of care are pressured, is that the organisation themselves has ceased to be as compassionate as it used to be or ought to be. And that's a really important way of nurturing empathy and compassion, and that celebration of these as valuable attributes to hold educationally and clinically.
Definitely.
Yeah, agree with all that. Yeah. We've got a comment here agreeing with Grant and Mike, talking about first placement and empathy and compassion, interestingly making the comment again about how empathy and compassion can burn you out slowly if you're not careful enough to recharge yourself, which I think is important. We've got Brené Brown quoted here, important to note the power of vulnerability. I agree, in the context of empathy, in the ability to convey it and experience it. And I think, we've got a comment about empathy and authenticity, which I think we've touched on, haven't we, as well, which I think is really important. So any thoughts on any of those?
Well, I think the authenticity relates very much to the statement Grant made about acceptance, and about being suspicious about the concept of being non-judgmental, and that seems to be a commonly bandied term in literature and in conversation. But if you really deconstruct it, as Grant said, I think that it'd be inauthentic to suggest that you're totally non-judgmental. The other thing, just harking back to what Alfonso said, the point Grant addressed, I think what's really important within within what he asked is that there is a semantic element to this that maybe doesn't transfer so well over some cultures. We know that the word compassion, for example, doesn't exist in French like it does in English. The French word for compassion is pitié. And there's actually somebody called Gladkova unpacked the concept that compassion and empathy as pro-social behaviours sometimes have the same term or a similar term in other languages. So we get into that this is an English semantic construction or set of constructions. And so there's a caution around that, which reflects the cultural competence angle of Alfonso's question. And the other is that empathy in particular has a resonance with a Western world humanistic school that may not be so readily transferable across the wider world. But in the developed world, we make that assumption that empathy means the same thing to everybody. And also in some textbooks are talking about how empathy's been used as a bit of a punchline in public life. Apparently they pick up on how Barack Obama used the word empathy a lot. And they said, well, what he was actually talking about was rational compassion. It's Paul Bloom's book. And he makes a case for what he said, what Barack Obama was talking about, societal rational compassion and not empathy, but we use the word empathy and we kind of chuck it around in modern life. And I have to say, before I was a nurse, I hadn't even heard the word empathy 30 plus years ago. It's certainly a word it's become much more part of the everyday lexicon of life in our society. So there's definitely a cultural caution there to hark back to that.
We're actually almost 40 minutes in, so we're going to be getting ready to round up in a bit. But I think if Vanessa could just round up any of the last questions, that would be a really thing, because we've got some. And also hello to the students that are watching as well. Hello.
We've had what's interesting is we've had a lot of questions tonight, and I think that this seems to have chimed with a lot of people, which is great. looking through a lot of the questions, a lot of the things are the themes that we've been covering about burnout, resilience, supervision, looking after yourself. One of the questions that we haven't talked about that I think is quite interesting, although we touched on it when we talked about Francis, was whether it's possible to develop organisational empathy. So I thought that was quite an interesting question. If you've got any thoughts on that one.
So hopefully I've returned and everyone can see and hear me.
Yeah,
IT
welcome
problems
back.
such as the burden. I hope everyone can be a wee bit empathetic towards my IT problems. But it's tough, isn't it? Because I almost said I love the idea of organisational empathy, but it's a very human thing when people come up with excellent solutions to their problems that then the large organisations take it over. We've seen that in recovery, we've seen that in resilience. Those where the organisational application of it almost takes away from it. So the idea that an organisation is really interested in evidences that's interested in its employees would be, for me, that would be what organisational empathy would look like. So yes, it would be consultation, it would be 360-degree consultation with who we work with, but it's about the evidence that comes afterwards, isn't it? About how changes are made as a result of the understanding. And I guess that's whether that's one-to-one, that's what we're talking about in empathic encounter, is about what changes as a result of having a deeper understanding and connection to each other at an organisational level. How does the organisation then change if it has a deeper understanding and connection to the people that it supports?
Yeah.
The one thing I did want to kind of really bring in about the sort of just the phrase empathy as an intervention is, it's very easy to see the social and psychological aspects of that intervention, but it's more profound than that. It is physiological as well. If we look at sort of the science around psychoneuroimmunology, if we look around epigenetics, even developmental trauma, which is really my background in child development, we know that physiologically we are influenced and changed by the sort of social ecology we find ourselves within. And so I think, we don't necessarily see that change. I've got a brilliant quote from Susan Pinker who talks about, giving someone a high five is enough to release oxytocin. Just a high five, changes us, releases that hormone in and of itself. So this, as well as being a psychosocial concept, is really actually a biopsychosocial context that therefore has a profound ability to change everyone involved in the interaction.
Definitely.
So I suppose the other thing I like to think about is the change it can create. I talked about the change you can see in students as they progress, particularly ones who've come from perhaps a lower base of awareness or skill at the start of this. And what I like about embedding a concept of empathy with students is how malleable, how adaptable they become to access a range of other helping strategies with people. Because you're tuning people in to actively listen and to feedback accurately. That is obviously the basis of so many psychological therapeutic approaches. So I think it really can make students very much more adaptable in a therapeutic and communication sense.
And it also really reinforces the place of phatic communication. We call it small talk. I think it really betrays the power of phatic communication in terms of having non-pathologically based conversation, having strengths-based conversation, being an interested human being in another human being. In fact, this week, Mike and I, our first year mental health field module for our 2020 cohort was launched, and we shared, a young quote with them, which was master, all the techniques, know all the strategies, but when you connect with a human soul, just be a human soul.
Yeah.
Definitely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of the language, you're right, it's really embedded in it. It's like soft skills, small talk. None of it it speaks of high level, but it's really essential to who we are as human beings. I think that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, by the way, who's asked questions and things like that. So if there's anything that we haven't got around to, we'll try and speak to you either through Twitter or Facebook Live. We'll come back to that. But I think maybe we'll just go around everyone and see if there's any last last ideas that people want to bring forward. So I'll come to Vanessa first. Is there anything that you want to leave people with?
Yeah, no, for me, it's been great how much discussion there's been on Facebook and Twitter tonight, and it's obviously a topic that's really resonated with people, and I'm really glad that we've covered it, because I think that, you know, we don't talk enough about it, and as Nicky's just said, it gets called a soft skill, but it's not really a soft skill, is it? It's one of the most complex skills and the most powerful skills that we've got as mental health nurses. So I think just to say thank you to our guests, and that it's a really kind of profoundly important topic, isn't it, to be discussing. And I think it's interesting how it weaves into some of the other discussions that we've had on here, particularly, you know, the discussions we've had about trauma and resilience early on, and some of the stuff we've just talked about system kind of resilience and system empathy and things. I think it would be good to perhaps come back to those things as well in a, you know, later date. So yeah, just found it really interesting. So thank you both.
And what about you, Mike? Is there anything that you wanted to add?
Just finally, you know, the whole notion of relating to another human being creates an emotional intensity, and we use the word intense to mean something that's kind of heavy, as I suppose in the 1970s kind of word, but in this case intensity meaning something intense as in engaged and really packed with potential for something good to happen. Obviously undischarged emotional intensity might result in things, or erroneously discharged emotional intensity might result in things like moral distress or burnout or compassion fatigue. But actually when it's channeled, it obviously gives that reward back to the practitioner, and when it's celebrated amongst the team, when there's a wraparound culture, it really becomes almost self-fulfilling and it regenerates itself. And so there's really something about recognizing that emotional intensity needs to be used productively, but that it's also culturally supported. And I think that's an important takeaway message when we think about threading through a curriculum or threading through professional practice.
Absolutely. How about you, Grant? What do you think?
Well, I was thinking about the Phil Barker quote that I really love, which is humility and professionalism live at opposite ends of the street. And I think empathy is actually, that humility is a value we don't talk about in healthcare. And actually, it's the key aspect for me in empathy, because if I have a sincere desire to understand you, that's because I recognise I don't know you. I don't know your story, and I don't know best, most importantly. So approach and empathy has to be for me about championing humility as a professional value within us. And it's not just okay not to know, it's the best thing not to know, because you offer the space and the expertise and the value and the empowerment to the person you're there to be with.
I love that. Much missed Phil Barker's inputs, I think. I'm digging out all my old tidal model stuff when we finished up.
Yeah. Well, he's a Fifer like me. I saw him recently, not recently, goodness, it'd be over a year now, I guess, because of lockdown. I saw him in a local shop just about a year and a half ago.
Still in the red clogs.
Still in the red clogs. Yep.
And I had an email exchange with him around the time that I finished my thesis. He's now an artist. He uses his mother's maiden name as his art name, Phil McLaughlin, and he posted some art around an email network that he had, and we ended up in a discussion about his art. But there was a lot of the themes that we got to know Phil, his humanity, his fusion of Celtic and Eastern philosophy, despite the complex conceptual thinking that he had, his whole notion that life was about relationship, that humility thing about how can I be useful to you, and a lot of these themes are reflected in the art that he does, and so we had an email exchange at that time, and so his mind is as vibrant as ever.
Good. I'll tell you, he was a massive influence on me when I was a baby nurse, so I'm really pleased to hear that. Dave sent me a couple of messages, by the way, people. Yes. So Equally Well have published a short guide. We'll just post it straight into the messages. Public Health England have released a new online training course for psychological first aid. There's a lot of information there. And NHS England has expanded their mental health support for staff. So that's something really to notice. Toughest year in health service history. So there's a lot of information there, and we'll be sharing that. Next week, this might be one for you, Gwyneth. You might find this interesting. We've got Asylum coming on, who are fantastic. So
Absolutely.
Mental health, radical mental health zines. So you'll like that. We've got Helen Spandler, Jill Anderson, and Tamsin Walker coming on, which would be so exciting. So hopefully we'll be able to tweet out some amazing art there and kind of almost follow on from what we've been discussing. But I just want to say thank you so much to our guests and the people who were watching. Really, really appreciate that. And I guess that just remains for us to say good night. Good night, guys. Take care.
Thanks.